How did Blizzard create one of the greatest villains in gaming history, with far less dialogue, cutscenes, and screen time than modern games have today? Because the strange thing about Arthas Menethil is that his story was never actually that unique. The fallen hero archetype existed long before Warcraft. Lucifer, Anakin Skywalker, countless tragic kings and heroes across mythology and fantasy. And yet somehow, Blizzard managed to turn Arthas into one of the most iconic characters gaming has ever seen. What's even more interesting is that early during Warcraft 3's development, Blizzard faced a pretty difficult problem. They needed a way to organically introduce the Scourge campaign into the story. And instead of simply creating another generic undead villain, Chris Metzen and the old Blizzard writers came up with something far smarter. They created a hero players would slowly become attached to first, before turning him into the monster the story needed him to become. Not because Arthas was pure evil from the beginning, but because players could always understand why he fell. To understand why Arthas became such a legendary character, you first have to understand who he was before the fall. At the beginning of Warcraft 3, Arthas isn't introduced as some dark anti-hero or future monster. He's a young prince, idealistic, impulsive, proud, but still genuinely trying to become the kind of ruler his people would need one day. And in many ways, early Arthas almost feels like Blizzard's dark interpretation of King Arthur, a young heir to a holy kingdom, a legendary blade waiting somewhere in the future, Uther as his mentor and father figure. Even the names themselves clearly echo Arthurian mythology. Except, instead of becoming Warcraft's greatest king, Arthas slowly becomes its greatest tragedy. And Blizzard starts building this tragedy surprisingly early, before the Scourge, before Frostmourne, before Stratholme. Even in the first human missions, you can already see parts of Arthas that will eventually destroy him. His impatience, his pride, his obsession with responsibility, and his fear of failure. At the same time, he still feels deeply human, especially in moments with Jaina. Long before Warcraft became obsessed with cosmic lore and universe-level threats, its story was grounded in very personal relationships. And Arthas and Jaina are one of the best examples of that. They clearly still care about each other, but their lives already started pulling them in different directions years earlier. Jaina left to study magic in Dalaran, while Arthas stayed behind to prepare for the day he would eventually become King of Lordaeron. And that detail matters a lot, because Arthas constantly feels trapped between two things: the responsibility of becoming the future king, and the fear that he might not be strong enough to protect his people when the time finally comes. Which is exactly why his transformation works so well. It doesn't happen instantly. Blizzard slowly changes the way Arthas speaks, behaves, and treats the people around him throughout the campaign. Early on, when Uther addresses him formally, Arthas even responds, "Please, Uther, not here. I'm not king yet." And that one small line says a lot about who Arthas still is at that point. He respects Uther. He understands he still has things to learn. He hasn't fully surrendered to his own ego yet. But then the Scourge arrives. Villages start dying. Citizens become undead. And Arthas slowly becomes consumed by the idea that failure is no longer an option, especially after Stratholme, which still remains one of the most debated moments in Warcraft history. Because Arthas wasn't trying to destroy his people. He genuinely believed he was saving them from something even worse. And that's exactly what makes the scene so powerful. Not everyone watching Warcraft 3 agreed with Arthas, but almost everyone understood why he made the choice. And from that point onward, you can feel the character changing rapidly. He becomes colder, more isolated, more obsessed. He stops listening to Jaina, stops listening to Uther, stops listening to anyone who challenges him. Until eventually, the same prince who once humbly told Uther, "I'm not king yet," later declares, "As your future king, I order you to purge this city." And shortly after, "I hereby relieve you of your command." That moment is important because it's no longer just about Stratholme. It's the moment Arthas fully convinces himself that only he can save Lordaeron. And from there, everything else becomes inevitable. Northrend, the endless pursuit of Mal'Ganis, and finally, Frostmourne, which becomes the true turning point of Arthas's entire story. Because Frostmourne doesn't simply make Arthas evil overnight. It amplifies everything already growing inside him. His obsession, his pride, his desperation to win at any cost. And the moment Arthas takes the blade, the Prince of Lordaeron effectively dies. What returns home is no longer the same person. He murders his own father, destroys his own kingdom from within, and slowly transforms from fallen paladin into the Lich King's greatest champion, a Death Knight commanding the Scourge itself. Which is exactly why the Undead campaign in Warcraft 3 works so well, because players are suddenly forced to witness the consequences of Arthas's fall from the other side. Not as the hero anymore, but as the monster he became. And by the time the Frozen Throne ends, Arthas barely even feels human at all. He feels cold, empty, almost consumed by destiny itself. Finally ascending Icecrown, placing the helm of domination upon his head, and becoming the new Lich King. Which is important because at that moment, his story almost feels complete already. The prince failed, the monster won, and Warcraft had created one of the most memorable, tragic villains gaming had ever seen.
My son, the day you were born, the very forests of Lordaeron whispered the name Arthas.
Then, years later, World of Warcraft announces its second expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, and almost instantly, players lose their minds. Because this wasn't just another new villain, this was Arthas, the same character millions of players watched fall back in Warcraft 3. And honestly, Blizzard could have very easily failed here. By the end of the Frozen Throne, Arthas' story already felt complete in many ways. The prince was gone, the Lich King had won. He sat upon the Frozen Throne overlooking Azeroth itself, and, for many stories, that would have been the ending. So Blizzard had a difficult problem again. How do you continue the story of a character whose tragedy already feels finished, without simply parasitizing on nostalgia and popularity? And surprisingly, they solved it masterfully. Because Wrath of the Lich King doesn't really treat Arthas like a traditional expansion villain. He's not constantly screaming about destroying the world. He's not written like some generic evil mastermind. Instead, the entire expansion slowly reveals something far more personal and unsettling. Arthas is testing Azeroth itself. Throughout Northrend, the Lich King constantly watches the player from a distance, appears briefly, manipulates events, pushes the heroes of Azeroth further and further toward Icecrown Citadel, almost like the entire expansion is one massive trial. And eventually, Blizzard reveals why. Arthas never intended to simply kill Azeroth's greatest heroes. He wanted to break them, raise them as undead, and turn them into the ultimate champions of the Scourge. Which makes the final confrontation in Icecrown even more powerful, because at the end, Arthas actually wins. He defeats the raid completely, kills the heroes standing before him, and only at the final moment, Tirion Fordring manages to break free, shatter Frostmourne, and release the souls trapped inside the blade. Not through some giant cosmic power, not through a universe-ending weapon, but through the destruction of the cursed sword that started Arthas' downfall in the first place. And then Blizzard delivers one final twist. There must always be a Lich King. Suddenly, everything becomes even darker. Because underneath all the horror, the Lich King was also unknowingly holding back the Scourge itself from completely consuming Azeroth, which transforms Arthas from simply a fallen prince into part of a curse that can never truly disappear. And that's what makes Wrath's ending so memorable even today. It's tragic, victorious, and terrifying at the same time. Arthas dies, but the world he helped create survives him. which is why Bolvar Fordragon willingly places the helm of domination upon his head, sacrificing his own freedom to become the new Lich King. And maybe that's why Wrath of the Lich King is still remembered so fondly even today, because Blizzard didn't simply bring Arthas back to sell nostalgia. They expanded his tragedy in a way that still respected everything Warcraft 3 had already built before. And then Shadowlands happened, which is probably one of the clearest examples of why many Warcraft fans criticize modern Blizzard storytelling so heavily. Because by the time Shadowlands released, Arthas' story already felt complete. Not just finished, complete. Warcraft 3 showed his fall, Wrath of the Lich King gave him his final confrontation, and Icecrown delivered one of the most iconic endings in Warcraft history. His tragedy had meaning, his death had weight, his legacy remained unforgettable. Which is why many players honestly believed Blizzard should have simply left Arthas alone after that. And the strange thing is, Arthas barely even appears in Shadowlands at all. After years of speculation and build-up, the character is reduced to little more than a fading blue soul fragment pulled out of Anduin during a short cinematic near the end of the expansion. And for many players, that moment felt almost surreal in the worst possible way. Not because people suddenly stopped caring about Arthas, but because the emotional weight of his entire story suddenly felt diminished. Warcraft 3 and Wrath spent years building Arthas as a tragic fallen hero, a prince destroyed by fear, pride, and obsession, someone whose downfall still gets debated decades later. But Shadowlands barely treats him like a character anymore. Instead, he almost feels reduced to a symbol, a nostalgic callback, a final reference to remind players that Arthas existed. And that's why the scene frustrated so many people. Because instead of expanding his tragedy like Wrath once did, Shadowlands almost unintentionally simplifies him into just another defeated villain inside a much larger cosmic storyline, which completely misses what made Arthas memorable in the first place. The tragedy of Arthas was never about cosmic lore. It was about a flawed human being slowly destroying himself while believing he was doing the right thing. That was the emotional core of the character. And maybe that's why Sylvanas saying, "Let even his name be forgotten," felt strangely symbolic to many players. Almost like modern Warcraft itself had forgotten why Arthas became legendary in the first place. Because what made Arthas iconic was never simply Frostmourne, the armor, or the Lich King aesthetic. It was the writing behind him. So Arthas is still remembered as one of the greatest villains in gaming history, even today. Not because his story was completely original, and not because Warcraft had revolutionary technology or cinematic storytelling back then, but because Blizzard understood something extremely important. Great villains are not created by power alone. They are created by tragedy. Arthas was never just the bad guy. He was a prince players slowly watched destroy himself step by step. Someone who genuinely wanted to save his people, but slowly became consumed by fear, pride, and obsession until there was almost nothing human left. And that's what made Warcraft storytelling feel so powerful at its best. It wasn't really about cosmic systems or universe-ending threats. It was about personal conflict, mentors, friends, kingdoms, choices, consequences. And the reason so many players still connect more strongly to older Warcraft stories isn't simply nostalgia. It's because those stories felt focused, grounded, human, even at their darkest moments. Which is why people still debate Stratholme decades later, why Frostmourne remains one of the most iconic weapons in gaming, and why the ending of Wrath of the Lich King still feels unforgettable to so many players. Because underneath all the armor, magic, and undead armies, Arthas never stopped feeling like a real person. And maybe that's the part of Warcraft storytelling Blizzard has struggled the most to recreate ever since. And if you made it all the way to the end, thank you. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate a like, a comment, and a subscription. It genuinely helps me keep making videos like this. Play chill.